The dog knew exactly where to go. That should have been Peter's first warning. But after 3 years of wandering the empty wastes, a man starts to ignore the warnings. He starts to see patterns where there are none, and misses the ones staring him right in the face. Animals don't navigate the desert like this. Not for 100 miles. Not with the dead certainty of a compass needle finding north. This German shepherd, though, this magnificent broken animal, limped forward with a purpose that defied all logic. It was as if he was following an invisible thread, a ghost road carved into the baked earth that only he could see. Peter Graves knew these trails. He'd walked them until his boots had become a second skin, and the sun had bleached all memory of another life from his mind. He'd never, ever seen anything like this. The dog's left hind leg was a mess. It dragged in the red dust, leaving a dark, wet line that the ants would soon find. But his eyes, dark and deep as a desert well, held a fire that was almost human, a raw, unwavering determination. Every time Peter tried to drift east, toward the distant promise of a town and a hot meal, the dog would stop. He'd plant his three good paws, look back over his shoulder, and let out a low, guttural whine that wasn't a plea for help. It was a command: follow. So Peter followed, south, always south, toward the towering red buttes of Monument Valley that clawed at the sky like the fingers of a buried god. It was a place he'd sworn he would never return to, a place that held the ghosts of the man he used to be. But that wasn't the strangest part. Not even close. The dog wore no collar. He had no brand, no mark of ownership. Yet he knew the desert's secrets. He knew where the water was. When they neared a hidden spring, one Peter had never found in 3 years of searching, the dog's pace would quicken. He'd pull ahead, his tail giving a single expectant flick. But when they passed the dry, cracked creek beds that offered only false hope, the animal wouldn't even give them a glance. He knew. It was uncanny. It was the behavior of an animal that had made this exact journey dozens of times. He wasn't lost. He was going home. And here's the part that really made Peter's skin crawl. After years of solitude, of trusting no one, of seeing a threat in every shadow and every stranger's smile, he found himself trusting this dog completely. He was following a wounded animal into the heart of a place he'd run from, toward a fate he couldn't even begin to imagine. He didn't know it yet, but this journey wasn't about the dog. It was about him. Helping this animal get home was about to force Peter to confront the one thing he could never outrun: the truth of what happened 3 years ago, the truth of why he was a ghost in his own life, and the truth of what was waiting for him hidden in the shadows of those red stone towers, a place where men like him, men running from their past, could finally stop. Or so he thought. The desert morning felt wrong. Peter had learned to read the landscape like other men read the morning paper, and today's headlines were grim. The sun was a pale, sickly disk, and the shadows it cast were long and twisted, pointing in directions that made the compass in his gut spin. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't the usual peaceful emptiness of the high desert. It was a heavy, pressing silence, the kind that comes before a storm or after a tragedy. It made him stop on the rocky outcrop where he'd made his cold camp, his hand resting on the worn stock of his rifle. Something was moving below him. Down the slope, tucked against the base of a wind-scarred boulder, was a shape. At first it looked like a pile of old rags, a common enough sight out here. But rags don't twitch, rags don't bleed, and they certainly don't make the low, pained whimper that drifted up to him on the thin air. He moved down the scree slope carefully, his boots slipping on the loose stones. The shape resolved itself. It was a dog, a big one, a German shepherd, his coat a matted mess of golden brown fur, dust, and dark, sticky blood. The animal's back leg was bent at an angle that made Peter's own leg ache in sympathy. Peter stopped 10 feet away. He knew the rules. An injured animal is a cornered animal. They bite, they snarl, they fight to the last. This one did none of those things. It simply lifted its massive head, and its eyes, intelligent and weary, locked onto Peter's. The expression in them wasn't fear, it was relief. "Easy there, fella," Peter said, his voice low and calm. He'd talked to more animals than people these last few years. They were better listeners. Looks like you've had a bad run of it. The dog's tail gave a single, weak thump against the ground. Peter noticed that despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, those eyes were sharp. They were focused. There was an unnerving intelligence there. And something else. Something that pricked at the back of Peter's neck. Recognition. As if this dog in this exact spot had been waiting for him. And only him. Peter shook the thought away. The sun was playing tricks on him. He uncapped his flask and poured a little water into his cupped hand. He knelt, offering it to the dog. The animal lapped at it gratefully, his rough tongue scraping against Peter's calloused palm. It was an act of trust Peter hadn't earned. As the dog drank, Peter looked at the leg. It wasn't a clean break. The flesh was torn, shredded. Claws. A big cat, maybe. Or a pack of coyotes that got more than they bargained for. The smart play was to walk away. Peter had a rule. Never get involved. Getting involved meant complications. It meant attachments. And attachments were a luxury a man like him couldn't afford. The past had taught him that lesson in Blood and Fire. He made to stand up, to leave the dog to its fate, and continue on his own lonely path. But then the animal did something that changed everything. He struggled to his feet, a pained grunt escaping his throat. He put no weight on the injured leg, but he stood. He took 3 deliberate limping steps. Then he stopped and looked back at Peter. His gaze was clear, his intention unmistakable. He was heading south, directly toward Monument Valley, toward the one place on earth Peter had sworn he'd never go again. Peter's chest went tight. That red rock labyrinth was a graveyard for him, filled with memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. He couldn't go back. He wouldn't. But the dog was already moving, dragging his ruined leg through the dust, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was moving with a painful, desperate determination. He was heading towards something that couldn't wait. And despite every survival instinct screaming at him to turn north, to run, to disappear back into the anonymous desert, Peter found himself following. The dog's endurance was astonishing. Peter was a hard man, accustomed to walking 30 miles a day under a punishing sun, but keeping up with the wounded animal was a struggle. The dog set a relentless pace, stopping only for the briefest moments to rest in the slivers of shade offered by the rock formations. But it was the route he took that truly baffled Peter. This wasn't a known trail. Peter had crisscrossed this section of the desert for years. He knew the game trails, the old prospector paths, the safest ways to move between the scarce water sources. This dog ignored all of them. He was leading Peter on a secret path, one that seemed to exist only in his mind. They skirted wide around a sun-drenched plateau where Peter knew rattlesnakes gathered in the morning heat. They picked their way through a narrow canyon that bypassed a dense thicket of chala cactus, the kind that could tear a man's skin to ribbons. It was impossible. No animal could know the land this well. And then they found the water. It was a small spring, tucked away behind a curtain of red rock that looked identical to 100 others they had passed. Peter would have walked right by it without a second thought. But the dog suddenly quickened his limp and squeezed through a narrow fissure in the stone. Peter followed and his jaw dropped. Inside was a hidden grotto, cool and shaded, with a small pool of crystal-clear water bubbling up from the ground. Peter knelt and plunged his hands into the pool, bringing the sweet, cold water to his lips. It was the best thing he had tasted in months. As he refilled his flask, he watched the dog. The animal wasn't drinking with the frantic desperation of a creature that had stumbled upon water by chance. He drank calmly with measured laps, as if he knew the supply was secure, as if he knew he'd be back tomorrow. "You've been here before?" Peter said aloud, the words sounding strange in the enclosed space. The dog's ears twitched at his voice, but he didn't look up. His eyes remained fixed on the southern horizon, which was now dominated by the jagged silhouettes of Monument Valley. They were getting closer. By midday, the heat was a physical blow. The sun hammered down, turning the rock into a griddle. Peter took off his spare shirt and fashioned a crude sling to support the dog's injured leg, taking some of the weight off it. The dog accepted the help without protest, leaning into Peter slightly as they walked. That simple act of trust gnawed at Peter. Animals that trusted humans this easily had been cared for. They'd been trained. They'd been loved. Someone had put a lot of time into this dog, teaching him, raising him to believe in the kindness of people. A kindness he still held on to, even after whatever nightmare had left him for dead in the desert. As the afternoon shadows began to stretch, the valley loomed larger, a place of myth and memory. Peter could now make out individual mesas and buttes, each one a landmark from his former life. The sight of them churned up a thick cocktail of guilt and regret in his gut. This wasn't just a place on a map, it was his history. The last place he'd ever felt anything close to hope, before he'd watched it all burn. The dog seemed to sense his hesitation. Whenever Peter's pace slackened, whenever he subconsciously tried to veer away from the direct path, the dog would stop. He would fix Peter with that same unnerving, intelligent stare until he corrected his course. There was no escaping it. The dog wasn't just leading him. He was pulling him, dragging him back to the scene of his greatest failure. They were only a few hours out now, close enough for the memories to start biting. The smell of wood smoke, the sound of children's laughter, the face of the woman he had failed to protect. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the images back down into the dark place where he kept them buried. And that's when the dog did something that turned Peter's blood to ice. He stopped, lifted his massive head to the sky, and let out a long, resonant howl. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was a call, a signal. The lonely cry echoed off the towering stone monuments, rolling across the silent desert. For a long moment, there was only the wind. Peter held his breath. Then an answer came. From somewhere ahead, hidden deep within the maze of red rock, another howl replied, fainter but unmistakable. The answering call came from a direction Peter found impossible. He scanned the base of the largest mesa, a sheer wall of rock 1,000 feet high. There was nothing there, just rock and shadow. But as he squinted, his eyes adjusting, he saw it, a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curling up against the red stone. It wasn't a campfire, it was a chimney. Tucked into a natural alcove at the base of the cliff were 3, maybe 4, low-slung buildings. They were built from the same red adobe clay as the surrounding landscape, their walls so perfectly matched in color and texture that they seemed to have grown right out of the rock. It was a settlement designed to be invisible, a place designed to be hidden from the world. Peter's stomach twisted into a cold knot. He had ridden past this very spot half a dozen times in the last 3 years. He was certain, absolutely certain, that nothing had been there before. Either he was losing his mind, or these people had moved in recently, and they had gone to extraordinary lengths to remain unseen. The dog's entire demeanor changed. The grim endurance was gone, replaced by an eager, frantic energy. His tail, which had been still for 2 days, was now wagging furiously. He broke into a hobbling run, the makeshift sling flopping uselessly as he pulled Peter forward with a strength that was shocking. He was desperate to get home. As they got closer, the details of the settlement became clearer. 3 adobe houses and a larger central building, arranged in a defensive semicircle. A sturdy corral held a few horses. Small, carefully tended gardens were nestled in protected pockets between the buildings, green and vibrant against the red dust. This was no temporary camp. This was a home, built to last. A figure emerged from the largest building, a woman. She was followed by 2 small children, a boy and a girl, who clung to her sides. She raised a hand to shield her eyes from the sun as she peered at the approaching man and dog. Even from a distance, Peter could see she belonged here. She moved with a quiet confidence, a grace born from living in a hard land. Her dark hair was tied back in a long braid, and her clothes were simple and practical. But it was the way she stood that made Peter slow his pace. She was alert, poised, ready for a threat. Not afraid, just ready. The injured dog let out a joyful bark and tried to run faster. The woman called out a name Peter couldn't quite make out. Hulk! And suddenly 2 more German shepherds appeared from behind the building. They were the spitting image of the dog Peter had been following, right down to the same intelligent, watchful eyes. Peter stopped dead in his tracks. A cold realization washed over him. This was no coincidence. The injured dog, Hulk, hadn't been lost. He'd been separated from his pack, from his family. He had somehow navigated hundreds of miles of brutal desert to get back to them. But that didn't answer the most important question, the one that made Peter's hands feel clammy. How had the dog known where to find him? How had he known that Peter Graves, a ghost of a man, would be on that specific rocky outcrop at that exact time, on that specific day? The woman was walking toward them now, her steps measured and cautious. The two children trailed behind her, their eyes wide. He could see her face clearly now. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 30, with strong, sharp features that hinted at native heritage. Her expression was a mask of guarded neutrality. The other two dogs were now swarming Hulk, whining and nudging him, their tails wagging in a blur of joyful reunion. But they kept their distance from Peter, their eyes never leaving him. They were protectors. The woman stopped about 15 feet away. It was a deliberate distance, close enough to talk, but far enough to give her time to react if he made a wrong move. It was the stance of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust strangers. "You brought Hulk back," she said. Her voice was steady, with a slight, unplaceable accent. "We weren't sure we'd ever see him again." Peter nodded toward the happy reunion of the dogs. "Found him a couple days north of here. He seemed to know exactly where he was going." "He always does," the woman said. But her eyes weren't on the dog. They were on Peter, studying him with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. "I'm Allison. This is my home." "Peter Graves," he replied, hesitating. He hadn't used his full name with a stranger in a long time. "I've passed through this valley before. Never knew anyone lived out here." "That's the point," Allison said, glancing back at the children, who had crept a little closer. "We value our privacy." Peter understood that. He'd been chasing privacy for 3 years, though his version involved constant motion, not a hidden fortress. "Well, I should be on my way. Just wanted to make sure he got back safe." He started to turn, eager to melt back into the anonymity of the desert. "Wait." The single word was sharp, like the crack of a whip. It stopped him cold. Allison's tone softened immediately, as if she was annoyed at herself for letting her urgency show. "I mean, you brought him all this way. You're tired. The least I can do is offer you a hot meal and a place to rest for the night." It was the oldest rule in his book. Never accept hospitality. Never stay in one place long enough to be remembered. He opened his mouth to refuse, to make his excuses and disappear. But something in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't just politeness. It wasn't just gratitude. It was desperation. A carefully concealed, tightly controlled desperation. She needed him to stay, and he had no idea why. "That's kind of you," he said slowly, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be," she insisted, taking a step closer. Now he could see the fine lines of worry around her eyes. "Actually, there's something I need to ask you, something important." Before Peter could ask what, the little girl ran forward, her bare feet kicking up puffs of red dust. She couldn't have been more than 9, with the same dark hair and old serious eyes as Allison. "Allison," the girl said, her voice tight with urgency. "Justin's coming. I see his wagon on the East Trail." The change in Allison was instantaneous. The guarded composure shattered, replaced by a flash of raw panic. She looked from the eastern horizon, where a plume of dust was indeed rising, back to Peter. The desperation in her eyes was no longer hidden. It was stark and terrifying. "How much time?" she asked the girl, her voice a low hiss. 20 minutes, maybe less." Allison turned back to Peter, her mind clearly racing. Whatever she had been about to ask him was now a matter of life and death. "I know we just met," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "And I know I have no right to ask. But I need your help. That man, Justin Harrow, he's not a good person. He wants this land. He's been trying to force us out. If he sees you here, if he thinks we're not alone anymore." She didn't have to finish. Peter understood. Justin Harrow was the reason for the hidden settlement, the reason for the watchful dogs and the wary children. He was the wolf at the door, and Allison wanted Peter to stand with her and pretend to be a protector. She wanted him to be the thing he had failed to be 3 years ago. The question was, could he risk it? Could he risk getting involved in someone else's fight when his own ghosts were still so close behind him? Peter looked at Allison's face, at the raw fear she was trying so hard to master. 3 years on the run had made him an expert in reading people. He knew trouble when he saw it. This woman, this hidden family, was in the worst kind of trouble, the kind that doesn't just go away. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Just be here," she said, relief washing over her face so powerfully it almost buckled her knees. "Just stand with me. Let him see you. Let him see the rifle on your back. He preys on the weak. He thinks we're weak." The dust cloud was much closer now. Peter could make out the shape of a buckboard wagon and two riders on horseback. His every instinct screamed at him to fade into the rocks, to become a ghost again. Staying meant a confrontation. It meant trouble. It was the one thing he had sworn to avoid. But then he looked at the little girl, her small hand gripping Allison's arm. He looked at the carefully built homes, a sanctuary carved out of the wilderness. It reminded him of another place, another time. It reminded him of the people he had failed, the ones he had walked away from. A decision that had cost them everything. A decision that haunted every waking moment and every nightmare. "What kind of pressure has he been using?" Peter asked, his eyes fixed on the approaching wagon. Allison hesitated, a flicker of shame in her eyes. "At first, he just made offers to buy the land. When I refused, he started with the suggestions, pointing out how dangerous it is for a woman and children out here alone, how easily accidents can happen." Peter's jaw tightened. He knew the type. "Last time he was here," she continued, her voice dropping, "one of our main water barrels sprang a leak overnight. We lost half our supply. It could have been an accident, but it wasn't." Peter looked from the approaching threat to the small, defiant community. He saw the children peeking from the doorways, their faces pale with fear. He saw the dogs, including the newly returned Hulk, standing together, a low growl rumbling in their chests. This wasn't just a piece of land. It was a home, bought and paid for with sweat and grief and hope. It was everything. "How long have you lived here?" he asked quietly. 4 years. Since the fire," Allison said, her voice catching on the last word. "My husband. He died in the fire that took our old home. I brought the children here. We needed a place to start over, a place where no one could hurt us again." Peter made his decision. In that moment, 3 years of running came to an end. He reached back and unslung his rifle. He worked the lever action, checking the chamber with a smooth, practiced motion. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was a statement. Men like Justin Harrow only understood one language. "I'll stay," he said. Relief and gratitude warred on Allison's face. "Thank you," she whispered. The wagon was close enough now to hear the squeal of its wheels and the jangle of the harness. The dust swirled, and through it, Peter saw the face of the man who wanted to burn this small world to the ground. It was time to meet Justin Harrow. Justin Harrow swung down from his wagon with the easy arrogance of a man who owned the world and was just deciding which piece of it to pick up next. He was tall, dressed in a tailored coat and clean boots that cost more than everything Peter owned. But it was his eyes that Peter watched. They were cold and calculating, sweeping over the settlement, cataloging every detail, every strength, every weakness. The two men on horseback behind him were not ranch hands. They were muscle. They sat their horses with a lazy stillness, but their eyes were constantly moving, their hands never straying far from the pistols on their hips. "Allison, my dear," Harrow called out, his voice a smooth, oily baritone that didn't quite cover the steel beneath it. "Good to see you again. I trust you've had time to reconsider my very generous offer." "I told you before, Justin," Allison replied, her voice impressively steady. Peter saw how she had subtly positioned herself between Harrow and the children. "This land is not for sale." Harrow's smile didn't falter, but his eyes slid past Allison and landed on Peter. The smile tightened. He took in Peter's dusty clothes, the lean hardness of his frame, and the comfortable way the rifle rested in the crook of his arm. "Well now," Harrow said slowly, "I don't believe we've had the pleasure." Peter said nothing. Silence was a weapon, and men like Harrow hated it. They needed to fill it, to control the conversation. Let him talk. Let him show his hand. "This is Peter Graves," Allison said, stepping forward slightly. "He's a friend. He's staying with us for a while." Harrow's eyes narrowed. He was reassessing the situation, the simple math of his intimidation plan suddenly complicated by a new variable. The two thugs on horseback shifted in their saddles, their expressions hardening. This was no longer just about scaring a lone woman. A friend, Harrow repeated, tasting the word. How interesting. It's a long way from anywhere to be visiting friends, especially in a place like this. Most folks would say this land is hardly worth the trouble. Seems peaceful enough to me, Peter said, his voice quiet but caring in the still air. Harrow studied him, a flicker of something, recognition, in his eyes. You look familiar. Have I seen you somewhere before? A cold snake uncoiled in Peter's stomach. He'd been careful. For 3 years, he'd lived on the fringes, avoiding towns, avoiding the law, avoiding anyone who might remember his face. But Harrow looked like the kind of man who had a long memory for other people's business. Doubt it, Peter said flatly. Perhaps not, Harrow mused, his smile returning. But this time it was all teeth. Still, I must admit my surprise. Finding a man of your profession so far out in the wilderness. There isn't much call for gunslingers out here. I'm not looking for work. No? Harrow's eyes gleamed. Then what, I wonder, brings a man like you to Monument Valley? The question was casual, but it was a probe, a knife sliding between the ribs, searching for a weakness. Before Peter could formulate a reply, one of the mounted thugs spoke up. Boss, I know him, the man said, pointing a grubby finger at Peter. That's Graves, Peter Graves. He was the head of security up at the Copper Canyon mine before the massacre. The words hit Peter like a physical blow. Copper Canyon. The name was a curse, a brand on his soul. The place he ran from in his sleep, the source of his 3-year exile. Harrow's expression transformed. The fake congeniality vanished, replaced by a look of genuine predatory delight. He had found the weakness. He had found the lever. Peter Graves, Harrow said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Of course, I remember the story now. That terrible business with the Apache raid. You lost a lot of good people that day, as I recall. A terrible failure of leadership. He was twisting the knife. Peter could feel Allison's eyes on him, full of shock and a dawning uncertainty. He saw the children shrink back further into the doorways, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the air. That was a long time ago, Peter managed to say, his throat thick. 3 years is not so long, Harrow countered smoothly, when you're the one who has to live with the consequences, or when you're the one buried in the ground. I have to wonder, Allison, does your new friend have a history of keeping the people under his protection safe? The familiar, crushing weight of his failure descended on Peter, heavy as a shroud. He could see the doubt poisoning Allison's mind. She was looking at him now, not as a potential savior, but as a liability. A man with a dark past who had brought his bad luck to her doorstep. This was the moment he always ran from. The moment his past caught up to him. For 3 years, his response had been to turn and walk away, to disappear before he could fail anyone else. But this time was different. Staring into Justin Harrow's smug, triumphant face, looking at the family huddled in the doorway behind Allison, something inside Peter snapped. Not in anger, but in defiance. The shame was still there, a hot coal in his gut. But for the first time, it felt like fuel, not an anchor. He had run long enough. Harrow saw the shift in Peter's eyes and his smile widened. He thought he had him. He thought Peter would crumble or lash out foolishly. And now here you are, Harrow continued, pressing his advantage, making promises to another helpless woman and her children. How long before your luck runs out again, Graves? How long before you get them killed too? Peter took a slow breath. He didn't look at Harrow. He looked at Allison. He looked her right in the eye, letting her see the truth of the shame he carried. He's right, Peter said, his voice clear and cold. The admission hung in the air, stunning everyone into silence. Harrow's smile faltered. This was not the reaction he expected. I failed those people at Copper Canyon, Peter continued, his gaze unwavering. I was arrogant. I made mistakes. And good people paid for my pride with their lives. I've spent 3 years trying to outrun that fact. He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. But a man can't outrun who he is. All he can do is decide who he's going to be. I'm not the same man I was 3 years ago, Harrow. I know what my mistakes cost. I know exactly what happens when you're careless with other people's lives. One of Harrow's men shifted, his hand drifting down toward his holster. Peter didn't even glance at him, but his body tensed, his weight shifting onto the balls of his feet. He was ready. This is all very touching, Harrow sneered, recovering his composure. A regular redemption story, but it doesn't change the facts. This land is wasted here. My offer stands, Allison. $500. Cash. It's more than this pile of dirt is worth. And if I refuse? Allison asked, her voice stronger now, drawing courage from Peter's stand. Harrow's mask of civility finally dropped away completely. His face became a cold, ugly thing. Then you will find out just how dangerous the desert can be for a woman alone. Accidents happen. Wells go dry. Sometimes people just disappear. The threat was naked, brutal, and final. Peter felt the old, familiar rage begin to burn in his chest. The rage that had led him into so much trouble in his youth. But this time, he channeled it. He focused it into a single point of ice-cold certainty. No, Peter said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. They won't. The finality in his voice was absolute. It was not a threat. It was a promise. Harrow took an involuntary step back. He was a bully and a predator, but he was also a businessman. He was good at calculating risk. And looking into Peter Graves's eyes, he suddenly realized he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The man standing before him was not a broken drifter. He was something far more dangerous. He was a man with nothing left to lose, who had finally found something worth dying for. The standoff stretched, silent and tense. The two thugs on horseback looked at Harrow, waiting for a signal, but the signal never came. Harrow was a coward at his core, a man who paid others to do his dirty work, and his hired guns, while tough, were not suicidal. They could see the difference between intimidating a helpless family and facing a man who had already walked through hell and come out the other side. This isn't over, Graves, Harrow finally spat, backing toward his wagon. This land will be mine, one way or another. No, Peter said again, his voice as calm and unyielding as the ancient stone behind him. It won't. Harrow scrambled into his wagon, his arrogant swagger gone. His men wheeled their horses around, keeping a wary eye on Peter as they retreated, kicking up a cloud of angry red dust. As they disappeared over the rise, a profound silence settled over the small homestead. For the first time in 3 years, the ghosts in Peter's head were quiet. He felt a stillness in his soul he had forgotten was possible. Allison approached him slowly, her face a mixture of awe, gratitude, and lingering fear. Thank you, she said, but he meant it. He'll be back. I know, Peter said, and as the words left his mouth, he was surprised by their truth. And I'll be here when he comes. He hadn't planned to say it. The thought hadn't even consciously formed in his mind. But he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that it was true. For 3 long years, he had avoided any commitment, any connection, any place that might feel like home. But standing here, in this hidden sanctuary, watching the children cautiously emerge from the house, seeing Hulk limp over to lean against his leg, Peter finally understood. He hadn't been running from responsibility. He had been running from the possibility of failing again, and his running was over. You don't have to do that, Allison said quietly, though her eyes betrayed how much she wanted him to stay. This isn't your fight. I know, Peter said, his gaze sweeping over the small, defiant settlement. He looked at the carefully tended gardens, the sturdy adobe walls, the faces of the children looking at him with a fragile, dawning hope. But you've built something here, something worth protecting. He looked back at Allison, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the faint stirrings of a future. And I think maybe it's my fight now. The days that followed were a strange dream for Peter. He fell into a rhythm that was alien to him, a life of purpose and routine. He wasn't just a drifter passing through. He was a part of something. He helped Allison repair the sabotaged water barrel, reinforcing it with iron bands. He spent hours walking the perimeter of the settlement, finding the weak spots, planning defenses with a grim expertise that he hadn't used in years. He taught the boy Leo how to set a snare and how to read the tracks of a coyote. He taught the girl, Maya, how to find north using the sun and stars. He learned their stories. They weren't siblings, he discovered. They were orphans, children Allison had taken in after they'd lost their own families. This small settlement wasn't just her home, it was an orphanage, a last refuge for the lost and broken. In the evenings, sitting by the fire as the vast desert sky filled with a spray of impossible stars, Allison told him her own story. Her husband, David, had been a geologist, a brilliant one. The fire that had taken him wasn't an accident. She was sure of it now. It had happened just after he'd made a major discovery, something he said would change their lives forever. He'd been killed and she had run, taking the children of his fallen colleagues with her, searching for a place so remote, so hidden, that the past could never find them. Listening to her, Peter felt a sense of chilling familiarity. He in turn told her the truth about Copper Canyon. Not the official story, but the real one. It hadn't been an Apache raid. The attackers had been too organized, too well equipped. They were mercenaries disguised to stir up trouble and drive the independent miners out. He explained his fatal error. He had trusted the wrong man. His second in command, a man named Miller, had vouched for the security of the main gate. Miller had been the one to open it from the inside. He had sold them all out. When the dust settled, Miller had vanished, and Peter Graves, the disgraced security chief, was left to take the blame. Allison listened, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. When he was done, the silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of their shared past. "You think finding Hulk was an accident?" she asked softly one evening, as they watched the setting sun bleed across the western cliffs. Peter looked at the dog, who was lying at his feet, his head resting on his boots. He thought about the impossible odds. A wounded dog appearing at the exact moment of his own deepest despair. A dog that knew a secret path to a hidden sanctuary. A sanctuary that desperately needed a protector, just as he desperately needed something to protect. "No," he said, "I don't believe in accidents anymore." But the fragile peace was shattered a week later. Maya, who had the sharpest eyes, was on lookout duty in a high nest they had built among the rocks. Her voice when it came was thin and sharp with panic. "Riders! 3 of them! They're not on the trail. They're coming through the West Canyon." Peter and Allison scrambled up to the lookout point. Peter raised his field glasses. It wasn't Harrow. These men were different. Harder. They moved with the grim efficiency of hunters. And one of them rode a familiar horse, a big gray gelding with a distinctive white blaze. Peter's blood ran cold. He felt the air leave his lungs. "What is it?" Allison asked, sensing the sudden terror in him. "Who are they?" Peter lowered the glasses, his hand shaking slightly. "It's Miller," he said, his voice a dead whisper. "The man from Copper Canyon, the one who betrayed us." The past hadn't just caught up with him. It had followed him here, and it had brought its guns. "He can't know we're here," Allison whispered, her face pale. "It's impossible." "Nothing's impossible," Peter said grimly, his mind racing. "Harrow must have sent for him. He needed a professional to finish the job." The pieces were clicking into place with horrifying speed. This wasn't just a land grab anymore. It was a cleanup operation. Whatever Harrow wanted on this land was connected to whatever had happened at Copper Canyon. "Get the children inside. Bar the doors," Peter commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "What are you going to do?" Allison asked, her hand gripping his arm. "What I should have done 3 years ago," he said, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "I'm going to finish this." He didn't wait for a reply. He scrambled down from the rocks, grabbing his rifle. He wasn't going to wait for them to reach the settlement. He wasn't going to fight a defensive battle. This time, he was taking the fight to them. He knew this terrain now. He'd spent the last week memorizing every rock, every crevice, every shadow. He moved quickly, using the landscape for cover, circling around to intercept them in a narrow pass a quarter-mile from the settlement. He found his spot, a small niche in the rock wall 20 feet above the canyon floor. He was invisible. He rested his rifle on a rock, calming his breathing, slowing his heart. He watched as Miller and his 2 men rode into the pass below. Miller looked older, harder. There was a long, ugly scar running down his cheek that hadn't been there before. He rode with the lazy confidence of a man who believed he was the predator. Peter centered the rifle sight on Miller's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy. One shot, and the ghost that had haunted him for 3 years would be gone. Justice, swift and silent. But he hesitated. Killing Miller in ambush wouldn't give him the one thing he needed more than revenge. It wouldn't give him answers. Why? Why had he betrayed them? Who was he working for? Peter took a deep breath and changed his aim. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot cracked through the silence of the canyon. But it wasn't Miller who fell. It was the horse of the man riding behind him. The animal screamed and went down in a tangle of flailing legs, pinning its rider. Before the other two could react, Peter fired again. This time he hit the rifle in the second man's saddle scabbard, the impact spinning the man out of his seat. 2 down, 1 to go. Miller reacted with lightning speed, diving from his horse and scrambling for the cover of a boulder, pulling his pistol as he moved. He was a professional. "Graves!" Miller screamed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I should have known Harrow was too cheap to hire real killers. Come on out and face me, you coward!" Peter didn't move. He stayed in the shadows, reloading his rifle. The game had changed. He had the advantage of position, but Miller was dangerous and cornered. Suddenly, a movement from above caught Peter's eye. On the rim of the canyon, directly above Miller's position, a figure appeared. It was Allison. She was holding a rifle, its stock pressed firmly against her shoulder. She had disobeyed his order. She had followed him, and she had a clear shot at the man who had brought death to her door. Before Peter could even shout a warning, she fired. The shot missed Miller, chipping a piece of rock inches from his head, but it gave away her position. Miller spun around, raising his pistol, and fired 3 shots in quick succession up at the canyon rim. Allison cried out and disappeared from view. A blind, white-hot rage, hotter than anything he had ever felt, consumed Peter. He leaped from his hiding place, abandoning all caution, and charged down the loose rock of the canyon side, firing as he went. He saw Miller turn, saw the surprise in his eyes, saw the pistol coming up to meet him. Time seemed to slow down. Peter knew he wasn't going to make it. He was too exposed, too far away. And then from the mouth of the canyon, a golden-brown blur erupted from the shadows. It was Hulk. The dog moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying, his injured leg miraculously forgotten. He hit Miller with the force of a freight train, 100 pounds of muscle and teeth and righteous fury. The pistol went flying. Miller screamed, a high, thin sound of terror and pain, as Hulk's jaws closed on his arm. Peter reached the canyon floor and kicked the pistol away. He grabbed Miller by the collar and slammed him against the rock wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Why, Miller?" Peter snarled, his face inches from his betrayer's. "Why did you do it?" Miller, his face ashen, his arm a bloody mess, just laughed. It was a weak, gurgling sound. "You still don't get it, do you, Graves? It was never about the copper. It was never about the raid." He coughed, spitting blood. "It was always about the land. This land. Harrow's employers. They've known what's under it for years." Peter stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle finally slamming into place. Allison's husband, the geologist. His discovery. The accidental fire. "What's under it?" Peter demanded. "Something worth more than all the copper in the state," Miller gasped. "Something they're willing to kill for. They killed for it then, and they'll kill for it now. You haven't saved anyone. You've just signed their death warrants." Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the canyon. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of engines. Multiple engines. Peter looked up toward the east trail. Coming over the rise wasn't a wagon. It was a convoy. 2 heavy-duty trucks and a dozen men on horseback, armed with repeating rifles. Harrow hadn't just come back with hired guns. He had come back with an army. And at their head, riding in the lead truck, was Justin Harrow himself, a look of triumphant fury on his face. He had played them all. The attack by Miller was just a diversion, a probe to draw Peter out. The real assault was just beginning. "Get up!" Peter yelled, hauling the terrified Miller to his feet. He looked up at the canyon rim. "Allison, are you hit?" "My arm, I'm okay," she called back, Her voice strained. "Get back to the house! Barricade the doors!" he screamed, shoving Miller in front of him. He was a prisoner now, a shield. They scrambled back toward the settlement as the first shots from Harrow's army kicked up dust around their feet. They were hopelessly outnumbered. This wasn't a fight they could win. It was a siege, an execution. They made it inside the main building just as the first wave of riders reached the perimeter. Bullets splintered the thick wooden door. The children were huddled in a back room, their faces white with terror. Allison was bleeding from a deep graze on her forearm, but she was already reloading her rifle, her jaw set with grim determination. "We can't hold them off," she said, stating the obvious. "There are too many of them." "I know," Peter said, his mind racing. He looked at Miller, who was slumped against the wall, a smug grin on his face despite his injuries. "It's over, Graves," Miller sneered. "Harrow wants the geologist's wife. He wants the journals. Give them to him, and he might let you walk away." "Journals?" Peter asked, turning to Allison. Allison's eyes widened. She ran to a loose floorboard beneath her bed and pulled out a thick, leather-bound journal. "David's," she whispered. "His research notes. I thought Harrow just wanted the land for grazing." "He doesn't want to graze on it," Miller chuckled darkly. "He wants to mine it. Your husband found a massive deposit of coltan, a rare earth mineral worth a fortune, enough to make Harrow's backers the most powerful men in the territory." It all made sense. The conspiracy wasn't new. It had started at Copper Canyon. David must have found traces of it there too. That's why the mine had to be taken, the independent operators wiped out. And David had been silenced before he could reveal the full extent of his discovery right here, under this very settlement. Hulk, the dog, whined and pushed his head under Allison's hand, then nudged the journal. "He always loved David," Allison said, her voice thick with emotion. "He used to follow him everywhere when he was surveying." Suddenly an idea sparked in Peter's mind, a desperate, insane idea. He looked from the dog to the journal to the map of the region hanging on the wall. "Allison," he said slowly, "did David ever survey the old mines at Copper Canyon?" "All the time," she said. "He was convinced there were hidden passages, old Spanish workings the original miners never found." Peter's heart hammered against his ribs. "The dog," he said, looking at Hulk. "He knew the secret path to get here, a path that avoided all the usual trails. What if he knows other paths? What if David trained him?" He grabbed the journal from Allison and flipped it open. The pages were filled with complex geological diagrams and chemical formulas. But in the back, tucked into a leather sleeve, was a hand-drawn map. It wasn't a map of the coltan deposit. It was a map of the old Copper Canyon mine, and it showed a route, a hidden entrance through a collapsed ventilation shaft on the far side of the mountain, leading deep into the earth. It bypassed the main entrance completely. At the end of the route was a small hand-drawn X. Next to the X were a few scribbled words: failsafe, the truth, for A, trust PG, for Allison, trust Peter Graves. David had known he was in danger. He had set up a dead man switch. He had hidden the proof, documents, ore samples, everything needed to expose Harrow and his conspiracy, deep inside the abandoned mine. And he had created a map for the two people he trusted most in the world to find it. And he had trained his dog, the loyal Hulk, to follow that very route. Hulk hadn't just been leading Peter home. He had been trying to lead Peter to the truth. Outside, the gunfire intensified. A heavy boom shook the house as Harrow's men started using dynamite on the outer wall of the corral. "They're not trying to get in," Peter realized with a fresh wave of horror. "They're trying to bury us. They're going to collapse the rock face above us." They were out of time. There was only one chance. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only move they had left. "I have to go," Peter said, his voice quiet but firm. "I have to get to that mine." "No!" Allison cried, grabbing his arm. "You can't. They'll kill you before you get 100 yards. "They'll kill us all if I stay here," he countered. "This is the only way. I take the proof from the mine. I get it to the federal marshal in Prescott. It's a long shot, but it's the only one we've got." He looked at the children huddled together, their eyes huge with fear. He remembered the woman and her son at Copper Canyon. He remembered his broken promise. Not again. Not this time. You have to create a diversion, he said to Allison. Draw their fire to the east side of the settlement. I'll slip out the west, through the gardens. Hulk will guide me. He saw the argument, the fear, the refusal in her eyes. But he also saw the grim understanding. He was right. He tore the map from the journal and stuffed it in his pocket. He grabbed a spare canteen and a handful of dry jerky. He looked at Miller, still slumped against the wall. He couldn't leave him here. You're coming with me, Peter said, grabbing Miller and hauling him up. You're my insurance policy. You're insane, Graves, Miller sputtered. We'll never make it. Then we'll die trying, Peter said. He turned to Allison one last time. There were 1,000 things to say, 1,000 emotions swirling between them, but there was no time. He simply squeezed her hand, a silent promise. I will come back. As Allison and the remaining dogs opened fire from the eastern windows, drawing a furious volley of return fire, Peter slipped out the back door. With Hulk at his side and a knife to Miller's back, he disappeared into the shadows of the rocks, the explosions and gunfire of his new life fading behind him. The race to Copper Canyon had begun. The journey through the night was a special kind of hell. The desert, which had been Peter's sanctuary for 3 years, was now an enemy. Every shadow held a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. Hulk moved ahead of them, a silent, ghostly shape, navigating the treacherous terrain with his uncanny certainty. Miller stumbled and complained, his bravado gone, replaced by the whining fear of a man whose luck had finally run out. Peter kept him moving with the sharp point of his knife in a series of grim promises about what would happen if he slowed them down. They moved west for 2 hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the siege. Then, guided by the stars and the dog, they turned north, beginning the long, desperate trek back toward Copper Canyon. Peter pushed them relentlessly, driven by the images burning in his mind. Allison's face, the terrified children, the explosions rocking their tiny home. By dawn, they were hidden in a rocky wash miles away. Peter risked a look back with his field glasses. He couldn't see the settlement, but he could see the smoke, a thick, black column rising into the pale morning sky. Harrow was burning them out. A cold, murderous rage washed over Peter. He shoved Miller to the ground. Who are they? He demanded, his voice a low growl. Who does Harrow work for? Who's powerful enough to cover up a massacre and kill a geologist and still be trying to steal his land 3 years later? Miller, terrified, finally broke. The railroad, he whimpered. Burlington Pacific Railroad. They want the coltan for new telegraph lines, for steel hardening. It's a secret project. They need that mineral to get the transcontinental contract. They'll kill anyone who gets in their way. The railroad. It was the largest, most powerful, and most corrupt entity in the territory. They owned politicians, judges, and lawmen. Getting the proof to the federal marshal suddenly seemed like an even longer shot. He might be on their payroll too. But it was the only shot they had. They traveled for another day and another night, a grueling, nonstop march. Peter was running on pure adrenaline and desperation. Hulk, incredibly, seemed to draw strength from his purpose, never faltering. They reached the outskirts of the Copper Canyon claim late on the second night. The place was a ghost town, even more desolate and haunted than Peter remembered. The skeletons of the burned-out buildings stood black against the moonlight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the empty doorways. It was a graveyard, and he was the one who had dug the graves. Hulk led them not to the main entrance of the mine, but around the back of the mountain, to a place of collapsed rock and tangled brush. It looked like a dead end, but the dog began to dig frantically at a specific spot at the base of the rock slide. Peter and Miller joined him, their bare hands tearing at the loose rock and dirt. After 10 minutes of frantic work, they uncovered it, a small, dark opening, barely big enough for a man to crawl through. The entrance to the ventilation shaft from David's map. You first, Peter said, shoving Miller toward the hole. The tunnel was tight and suffocating. The air was stale and dead. They crawled on their hands and knees for what felt like an eternity, following the whimpering Hulk. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a larger passageway, an old mine shaft. They were in. Peter lit a precious match. They were in a section of the mine he had never seen before. The walls were shored up with ancient, rotting timbers. He checked David's map. They had to go deeper. The X on the map was in a small, dead-end chamber used for storing blasting powder. As they approached, Peter saw fresh scratches on the rock wall. Someone had been here recently. His blood ran cold. It was a trap. He shoved Miller forward. "Go on, get the box," he ordered. Miller hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't see anything." "In the corner," Peter said, pointing to a loose pile of rocks. "Under there. Now." As Miller reluctantly stepped into the chamber, a voice echoed from the darkness behind them. "Drop the rifle, Graves. It's over." Three men stepped out of a side tunnel, their lanterns held high. They were not Harrow's thugs. They were clean-shaven, dressed in dark suits, and carried new-model Henry repeating rifles. They looked like Pinkerton agents, railroad men, and standing with them, a smug look of triumph on his face, was Justin Harrow. "You led us right to it," Harrow said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "We knew the geologist had a stash somewhere in here. We just couldn't find the entrance. We've been watching this place for weeks. When Miller's trackers reported you were heading this way, I knew you'd show us the way. It had all been a lie. The siege, the smoke, it was all a performance to drive him here, to make him lead them to the one thing that could destroy them." Miller, seeing his true boss, made a run for it, scrambling toward Harrow. "I did it, boss! I got him here!" Harrow didn't even look at him. He simply nodded to one of his men. The man raised his rifle and shot Miller in the back. Miller crumpled to the ground without a sound. "Loose ends," Harrow said with a shrug. "Now the box, Graves, and the map." Peter was trapped. Three rifles were pointed at his chest. Hulk let out a low, menacing growl. "The dog, too," Harrow said with a sneer. "I hate dogs." Peter slowly unslung his rifle and let it clatter to the ground. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the map. He was beaten. He had failed again. He had led them right to the truth, and now they were going to bury it, in him, forever. He looked at the spot where Miller had fallen, and he saw it. Sticking out of Miller's jacket was a small bundle of dynamite sticks and fuses, no doubt brought along to seal the mine after they were done. A final, desperate gamble formed in his mind. "All right, Harrow," Peter said, tossing the map onto the ground. "You win. The box is under those rocks." As Harrow and one of his men cautiously entered the chamber, their eyes fixed on the pile of rocks, Peter made his move. He dove for Miller's body, grabbing the dynamite. He ripped out a short fuse, stuck it into one of the sticks, and scraped the match in his pocket against the rock floor. The fuse sparked to life. "Hulk, go!" he screamed, pointing back down the tunnel they had come from. The dog, understanding the urgency, turned and bolted into the darkness. Peter threw the lit stick of dynamite not at Harrow, but at the ceiling of the main passageway, right at the spot where the old rotting timbers were already groaning under the weight of the mountain. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The world turned into a storm of noise and dust and splintering wood. The ancient timbers shattered, and with a terrible grinding roar, the ceiling of the passageway collapsed. A wall of rock and earth came down, sealing the chamber, sealing Harrow and his men inside their tomb. Peter was thrown back by the blast, his head hitting the rock wall. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the small, dark entrance of the ventilation shaft, and the last thing he heard was the frantic, distant barking of a very good dog. He woke to the rough, wet tongue of Hulk licking his face. The air was thick with dust, and his head felt like it had been split open with an axe. He was lying just outside the entrance to the ventilation shaft. The dog had dragged him out. He sat up, his body screaming in protest. The mine was sealed. Harrow and the railroad men were gone, buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock. The truth was buried with them. He had survived. He had stopped them, but he had failed. The proof was gone forever. There was nothing to take to the marshal. Allison and the children, they had won the battle, but lost the war. The railroad would just send more men. They would never, ever stop. He staggered to his feet, leaning on the rock wall for support. He was a dead man walking. There was nowhere left to run. Hulk whined, nudging something at Peter's feet. It was a small, heavy metal lockbox. Peter stared at it, uncomprehending. Then he looked at the pile of fresh dirt and rock next to the entrance. The dog hadn't just dragged him out. While he was unconscious, Hulk had gone back in. He had followed David's final command. He had dug up the failsafe. With trembling hands, Peter smashed the lock on a sharp rock. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of old cloth, were stacks of bonded legal documents, signed affidavits from other geologists David had corresponded with, and a dozen canvas bags filled with dull, gray ore samples. It was all there. The truth. David's last will and testament. His legacy. Peter sank to his knees, pulling the dog close, burying his face in the animal's thick fur. For the first time in 3 years, Peter Graves wept. He wept for the man he had been, for the friends he had lost, and for the second chance he had just been given. The journey to Prescott was a blur. Peter, driven by a new and powerful purpose, barely slept. He and Hulk traveled hard and fast, avoiding the main roads, living off the land. 2 days later, they walked into the federal marshal's office. The marshal was a hard-faced old man with tired eyes who looked like he had seen it all. He listened to Peter's story without expression, his fingers steepled under his chin. He examined the documents, weighed the ore samples in his hand, and read the affidavits. When Peter was finished, the marshal was silent for a long time. Peter's heart sank. Miller was right. The railroad owned everyone. "The Burlington Pacific," the marshal said finally, his voice a low rumble. "Those sons of bitches have been a thorn in my side for 5 years. I could never get anything to stick. They always buried the evidence and the witnesses." He looked up at Peter, and for the first time, a faint glimmer of a smile touched his lips. "But this is a smoking gun. This is enough to get federal warrants, to get the Army involved." He stood up and offered his hand to Peter. "You've done a good thing, Mr. Graves, a very brave thing." A week later, Peter rode back into Monument Valley. He wasn't on foot anymore. He was riding a fine horse, leading another packed with supplies. As he approached the hidden settlement, he saw the signs of the siege. The corral was burned, and the walls of the main house were pockmarked with bullet holes. But the settlement was still standing. Allison was outside, reinforcing the door. When she saw him, she dropped the hammer and ran. He swung down from his horse, and she crashed into him, her arms wrapping around him, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. The children, Leo and Maya, ran out, laughing and shouting his name. The other 2 dogs barked joyfully, circling them. And then Hulk, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook, pushed his way between them, demanding his share of the attention. That night, Peter told her everything. The trap, the explosion, the railroad's conspiracy brought to light. He told her how the Army had moved in, arresting dozens of Burlington Pacific executives, how Harrow's name was on a warrant, though his body would never be found. He told her the land was safe now, protected under federal observation. No one would ever threaten them again. They sat by the fire, just as they had before, but the ghosts were gone. The silence between them was no longer filled with unspoken grief, but with a quiet, comfortable peace. "David would have liked you," Allison said softly. "He always said you were the most stubborn, honorable man he'd ever met." Peter looked into the flames. He had spent 3 years running from his past, believing he was a failure. But maybe, just maybe, he had been running toward this, toward a place where his stubbornness and his honor could finally build something instead of breaking it. He had found more than just a sanctuary in the desert. He had found a home, he had found a family, and he had found redemption, not in running, but in standing his ground. He was no longer a ghost. He was Peter Graves, and he was finally where he was supposed to be. If you enjoyed this story of a man's long road to redemption, click the video on your screen now for another incredible tale of courage against impossible odds. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Your support helps us bring these journeys to life. Thank you for watching.